A falcon holds something precious in its talons, a great silvery fish snatched from the waters of a deep lake. The falcon flies above a sea of clouds with a bright yellow sun overhead. Out of nowhere comes a gust of wind. The falcon falters. The fish slips from its claws. The great bird lets out a cry of dismay and watches helplessly as the treasure disappears into the mantle of clouds. Urgency rushed in to clear Johnny's thoughts. Where's my mandolin? It's on the stage. It's plugged in. Bearclaw looked at Frankie and his face darkened. He pointed an accusing finger. This is what happens, he began, but he did not finish his thought. He turned and they were out into the clamoring crowd. The mood in the meadow had lost all the gentle mirth of a festival. The voices now rolling, drunken and sloppy. Many voices at once, but few in unison, at least not for very long. From a distance, the glow of the lamps seemed to be panning and throbbing like sheet lightning. Drawing closer, Johnny could see that men had shimmied up the poles and were deliberately swinging the lamps. People had climbed onto the roof of the cow barn and were jumping off into the crowd. The hoop girls dashed from side to side trying to catch the falling bodies in the hoop. Mummers who ordinarily performed their rites in rings were now scattered about, their robes soiled, each one twirling to some private rhythm. All the tables had been knocked over, garments, pottery, produce trampled in the mud, and through the crowd strode the mayor, still in his shiny blue robe and starry wizard's hat, now wielding his wooden staff taller than his head and spiraled round with painted green vines. May there be cows, he bellowed, thrusting his wand into the air. Honor the principles of electricity. He was drunk. People were grabbing his pole and trying to wrestle it to the ground, the ragged chants swelling from their voices. Birdie man! Birdie man! When the musicians jumped on the stage, the focus of the crowd shifted. All faces turned forward, and the din of voices pulled together in unison. No words were distinguishable above the roar, save for the mayor's voice weaving through the bodies. Cows! Electricity! And the crowd's chanted echo. Burly man! Fists were raised. Smaller people climbed on the shoulders of larger people to get a better view. A black box stood in the corner, a bank of red lights glowing. Wires like vines spilled across the floor. All eyes were on Bearclaw as he snatched one of the wires and thrust the metal plug into the hole in his guitar. A deafening squawk blasted from the box. People screamed. Women covered their ears. Bear Claw strummed the strings. The sound was like a full toolbox being dropped onto a metal plate. Jocko plugged in the washboard and plugged the catgut once. The floor shook like thunder. "Are we tuned?" Jocko asked. "We are not," Bear Claw answered. "All right then." Jocko lit into his single string with purpose and intention. The floorboards began throbbing a rhythm, more vibration than sound. Johnny felt it in the pit of his stomach and the hollow cavity of his chest. Jocko himself looked surprised. The power of the sound almost threw him backwards, but he kept going. Bear Claw joined in. The dissonance of the 6 untuned strings exploded with a ferocity that startled everyone, no less Bear Claw himself. His whole body puffed up like a cat in a fight, and a sly smile curled to his lips. His fingers slammed into the rhythm that Jocko had established, and the crowd went wild. With a backbeat to connect them, everybody started moving in unison, and the shouts and the hoots began to assume the regularity of music. Ant lifted her bow and touched it to the strings. A single clear tone penetrated the frenzy of Bear Claw's fretwork. It seemed to frighten her. She stared wide-eyed at her bow arm as if it were a thing possessed. But as he watched her, Johnny saw her reserve crumble. It started with her hips. They began to sway, and her shoulders relaxed. She closed her eyes. The notes that poured forth were long, strong, and screaming. They ascended like birds with wings on fire, like leaves and branches in a spiraled wind. Johnny knew it was time. He strummed the strings just before he sank the plug into the opening. Cathedral of sound burst fully constructed into the air, and immediately he heard the voices. "Arcane! Arcane! Johnny Arcane!" So, this was it. This was what he had been told by Mab, by Bow Wow, the secret in the stories. Destiny in her relentless pursuit, overriding all the longings and sorrows of the individual heart. Like a storm rolling over a mountain, like the relentless waves of the sea, like a cow giving birth in the snow, like a forest slowly growing its boundaries outward into the land of chaos and cruelty. There was no choice to be made. With tears streaming, Johnny flung himself into the music. Riding Jocko's resilient heartbeat, the instruments clashed and bickered and sought common ground. Harmonies were forged from dissonance. Counterpoint emerged from cacophony. Across the meadow, arms were raised and swaying from side to side. Faces beamed with wonder. This was like nothing they had ever heard before, and its sheer power swept them up. Bodies writhed and reeled. One man in front fell on his face. Others lifted him up and passed him, flailing and hollered with something flailing over their heads into the mass of the crowd. People screamed and hollered with something close to defiance, as if they meant to drown out the noise with their own voices, to no avail. At the back, near the cow barn, Johnny saw something happen. Two men, vigorously thrashing to the rhythm, collided, and each fell to the ground. One, his neighbors had to help up. The other stood up on his own, whereupon immediately they rushed each other and collided again. Johnny couldn't tell if it was a playful dance or an angry tussle, but it caught on at once. Others around them began throwing themselves at each other, knocking each other down, picking each other up. One man started swinging his arms about wildly, striking anyone who came within arm's length. A cloud of dust swelled above the small patch of revelers, and the crowd shifted, hiding the incident from view. But then it began in another place, in another part of the crowd. A small cluster of people began hurling themselves at each other, ramming their bodies together, tumbling into a heap. From the cow barn, a spinning motion began, a single mummer, twirling wildly, trailing a stream of colored ribbons, oblivious to anyone in his path. A few people were knocked down. Others saw him coming and threw up their arms as a barricade. One man grabbed him by the robe, drew him back, and thrust him forward like a stone from a slingshot. The mummer lost his balance and pummeled headlong, knocking several people down before he rolled against a broken flower stand. Johnny glanced at Bearclaw, whose eyes were already fixed firmly upon him. There was panic in those eyes. They said, "What do we do now?" But he kept playing. He tried to modulate the sound into something less aggressive, more stately. Johnny lit into the melody of Sweet Garnet's Reel, but it sounded more like the horned pig's revenge on his untuned strings. Out on the meadow, more and more zones of disturbance broke out, and everywhere the moving bodies were losing their sense of unity. Some swayed right, some swayed left, and the torsos collided with intention. Two women, each astraddle the shoulders of a man, engaged in a thrusting match. Hoop girls moved through the crowd with their hoop taut, and people were jumping into it and bouncing out onto the ground. A shoe went flying through the air. Then another, then another. Soon, other things were thrown. Food, mostly potatoes, from an overturned produce stand perhaps. For a moment, the air was full of potatoes. A potato struck the back of the head of a shirtless man, and he wheeled around, fists clenched. There was a short scuffle, quickly swallowed up by the surging crowd. Then, from the front of the crowd, Johnny heard a shout that chilled him with its menace. A swarthy hunchback with long, shaggy hair and a grizzled chin was brandishing a rusty dagger. His words were fierce but unintelligible. They sounded something like, "Ginas hurdy mani oof oody fullamuckle." A skinny mummer in a soiled robe stood back and held his hands up to his sides. He said something like, "Hurdy mani molo wolo." The hunchback leapt at him, knife first, twirling it between his beefy fingers. The mummer fell backwards, and the knife swiped sloppily over the top of his head. Someone grabbed the hunchback by both arms, and another man stepped out of the crowd. This one was huge, barrel-chested, shirtless, and bearded. "Gimme him," he growled, and raised a serrated fillet knife, clearly taken from the scullery. The hunchback broke loose and tossed his dagger from one hand to the other. "I'll have you blubbered," he uttered. Some of the people nearby started chanting, "Woof, woof," and raising their fists. The two combatants faced each other and began circling, each making little jabs in the air with his blade. Out of nowhere, Mayor Burlyman appeared and jumped between them. He was still carrying his staff, but his wizard's hat was missing. It sounded like he said, "You'll have to cow me first." Someone stumbled forward and tackled the mayor to the ground. The combatants set upon each other at once, but the big man quickly wrested the dagger from the hunchback, whereupon someone jumped on the big man's back, and the hunchback threw a grazing sidelong punch across the big man's face. The big man started writhing his arms around as if they were snakes with knives in their mouths, while behind him more and more people swarmed in to see the fight. There was an enormous amplified crash. Johnny looked up at Bearclaw. Bearclaw had pulled the plug from his guitar. "Let's get out of here," he urged. The music pummeled to a halt. Ant had already stopped, and as soon as Jonko damped his last deep tone, it was like the bottom fell out of the known world. All across the meadow, bodies were falling, rolling, scuffling, throwing punches. But in the sudden disappearance of amplified sound, the crowd's voices seemed weak and puny like flies buzzing around a corn lamp. "Bring your instruments," cried Bearclaw. "Follow me." Ant swept Chestnut up into her arms. They ducked through the small opening at the back of the stage. Jocko could barely fit through with his wash bucket. Just as Johnny broke through, he caught the sound of the mayor's voice above the chaos. "There will be cows. There will be electricity.